They were certain they had already passed this tree because one of them had carved his name into it the day before. The mark was still there, fresh enough that sap had begun to bead around the letters. A shallow cut, done in impatience, not ceremony. The kind of mark a man leaves when he is confident he will never see the place again. And yet the path curved, the foliage thinned, and the tree stood exactly where it had stood before. No one spoke at first, not because they were afraid, but because each of them was doing the same private arithmetic, measuring distance against memory, sun against shadow, step against step. The numbers did not reconcile. This was not how one became lost. In the year 1778, travel through the interior of the Philippine Islands followed rules that had been tested by generations. Roads were rarely straight, but they were consistent. Rivers bent but obeyed gravity. Jungle paths, cut and recut by traders, missionaries and porters, shifted with the seasons, but did not betray those who respected them. These men were not inexperienced wanderers. They were a small party moving inland from a coastal settlement, bound for a mission station several days' travel away. 2 merchants carrying trade goods wrapped in oilcloth. A catechist assigned to deliver letters and supplies. 3 porters recruited locally, and a guide who knew the route well enough to walk it in darkness. They were not soldiers. There was no expeditionary bravado, no weapons drawn in expectation of conflict. This was routine movement, recorded later not as an adventure, but as an interruption. And yet, by mid-morning of the second day, the road had begun to behave incorrectly. The forest was familiar, too familiar. The same dip where rainwater pooled, the same cluster of broad-leafed plants bent low over the trail, the same fallen branch lying parallel to the path, bleached at one end, dark with rot at the other. The catechist was the first to voice it, quietly, as if testing whether the thought itself might cause offense. "We have passed this place," he said. The guide disagreed at once. He did not hesitate. He did not hedge. He said the name of the next landmark ahead and described it accurately. A bend where the ground rose slightly, a stretch where the trees thinned and the light grew harsh. They continued. They reached the bend. They reached the thinning trees. The light did grow harsh, and then the path curved back into shadow, and the carved tree stood before them again. By then, the sun had climbed high enough to erase doubt about time. This was not a matter of walking in circles unknowingly. The shadows had shifted, hours had passed, sweat had soaked cloth and dried again. They attempted the first correction then, not with panic, but with discipline. The guide turned them around deliberately. He chose a different line, cut through undergrowth where the path narrowed, marked a trunk with charcoal from the catechist's fire kit. They walked with intention, counting steps, watching the slope of the land. Before noon, they reached the charcoal mark. It had been smeared, as if brushed by a hand or shoulder. No one suggested turning back again. Among the porters, a word passed quietly. Not spoken aloud at first, but shared in glances, in the way one man's pace slowed to match another's. When it was finally said, it was said without drama. Naliligaw, led astray, not lost, not confused, guided incorrectly. The concept was not new. Indigenous communities across the islands had long warned travelers about certain stretches of road, places where direction softened, where paths behaved like water rather than ground. The Spanish recorded these warnings in margins and footnotes, usually to dismiss them. Fatigue, heat, superstition. The merchants laughed it off at first. They blamed the humidity, the sameness of jungle terrain. One suggested they rest longer at the next stop and press on with clearer heads. But the guide had stopped walking. He stood facing the trees, listening, not to the forest itself, but to the absence of it. No birds called, no insects rose from the brush. Even the wind had thinned, as if passing elsewhere. "This is not right," he said. They ate without appetite. Water was measured more carefully now. The catechist made a note in his journal, not of enchantment or spirits, but of repetition. of landmarks recurring at improper intervals. He would later cross that entry out, then rewrite it in smaller script. In the afternoon, they tried again to break the pattern. This time, they left the path entirely, cutting crosswise through terrain no one would choose willingly. Roots tore at their feet, thorns caught at clothing, progress slowed to a crawl. After nearly an hour, the ground dipped gently, the foliage opened, and the road emerged beneath them. The same road, the same direction, the same carved tree visible through the brush. One of the merchants swore, another laughed, sharp and brittle. The guide said nothing at all. By then, something else had begun to fail, not direction, but sequence. Events no longer followed cleanly from one another. Conversations stopped mid-sentence without memory of beginning. The catechist noticed that his ink dried more slowly than it should, though the heat had not changed. One porter insisted the sun had already set once that day. No one argued with him. They walked until their legs burned, then rested, then walked again. Each effort felt sincere, each result was the same. As evening approached, the forest shifted again, not in layout, but in tone. The light dulled without dimming fully. Colors flattened. Depth became harder to judge. The path ahead looked correct, but distant in a way that resisted approach. The guide finally spoke the warning he had been holding back. "There are places," he said, "that do not move unless they wish to." The catechist asked what wished meant, precisely. The guide did not answer. At dusk on the second day, as they stood arguing whether to camp or press on, they heard the sound behind them. Hoofbeats, not loud, not charging, measured, slow. The sound of something large walking carefully, matching distance with intent. They turned as one. The path behind them was empty. The hoofbeats continued, never closer, never farther, keeping perfect pace as the light failed and the forest closed in around a road that no longer led anywhere at all. Someone was walking ahead of them. Yet when they called out, no one answered and no footprints appeared. The sound was unmistakable once they noticed it. Not the erratic crash of animals moving through brush, nor the careless scuff of their own sandals against packed earth. These were measured steps, balanced, heavy enough to register, slow enough to feel intentional. Always ahead. Never seen. At first, they assumed it was one of them. Fatigue made sounds travel strangely in the forest, and distance could compress itself when the air grew thick. But the cadence did not match any stride among them. It was too even, too patient. The catechist stopped and raised his hand. The others halted behind him, breath rasping quietly in the warm dusk air. "Who walks in front?" he called. No answer came, only the continuation of footsteps, retreating at the same pace they advanced. The guide's face tightened. He scanned the path ahead, then the ground beneath his feet. The earth was soft from recent rain, dark and receptive. Their own prints were clearly impressed. Some overlapped from earlier passes, evidence of the looping they could no longer deny. But ahead of them, the path was unbroken. No heel marks, no displaced leaves, no sign that anything with weight had touched the road. The merchants began speaking at once, voices rising over one another. One insisted it was an echo, another blamed birds mimicking sound. A third suggested that one of the porters was playing a cruel joke. The guide silenced them with a gesture. "This is not trickery," he said. "It is guidance." That word settled badly among them. They continued walking, though now each step carried hesitation. The path seemed clearer than before, almost inviting. Branches bent away just enough to allow passage. Thorns snagged less frequently. The road felt correct, the way a true route does when instinct aligns with terrain. And yet the landmarks began to repeat again, closer together this time. A stone half buried near the edge of the path. A twisted root shaped like a knuckle. A leaning palm scarred by old cuts. They passed the same stone twice within an hour. When the catechist asked the guide to explain, he hesitated longer than before. "There is a name," he said finally. "Not a single one." Many, but you would call it Tikbalang. The merchants laughed again, though less convincingly. One crossed himself without realizing it. The Tikbalang, according to local account, was not a beast that attacked travelers. It did not ambush or devour. It misled. It delighted in correction and confidence. It allowed you to believe you were right, until the road proved otherwise. Spanish friars had written of it before, usually with impatience. They described mocking spirits of the road, blamed for delays and disappearances that could be better explained by heat, fear, or native superstition. One chronicler dismissed the Tikbalang as an excuse for poor navigation, but those same records noted patterns the writers could not explain. Travelers found circling familiar ground, hearing laughter where no children were present, feeling watched from above without ever seeing movement. The catechist knew these texts. He had studied them in seminary. They had never felt relevant until now. As darkness deepened, the sounds multiplied. Footsteps now came from more than one direction. Sometimes behind them, sometimes off to the side. Once, briefly, from directly above, as if something moved along the canopy with weight too heavy for branches to bear. Breathing followed, slow, exaggerated, close enough that the catechist felt it at the nape of his neck and turned sharply, heart hammering. Nothing stood there. One of the porters began whispering prayers in his own language. Another snapped at him to stop, voice brittle with strain. The merchants argued whether to camp or continue, neither option feeling safe. They chose to walk. The guide advised silence. He said the road listened. It was then that the laughter came. Not loud, not mocking in the way of children or drunks. It was low and rhythmic, like breath shaped into sound. It rose when they paused, faded when they moved, always remaining just out of reach. The catechist tried to mark time again, counting steps between sounds, measuring intervals. The pattern refused to hold. Sometimes the laughter came twice in quick succession, sometimes not at all. One of the merchants, youngest of the group, lost his patience. He stepped off the path without warning, drawn toward a cluster of trees where the laughter had last sounded. The guide shouted for him to stop, but the man waved him off, convinced now that the sound belonged to a person hiding just beyond the brush. They watched him disappear between the trunks. For a moment, the forest swallowed all sound. Then the footsteps resumed, this time circling them. They waited, minutes stretched thin. The catechist tried to pray, but found his words repeating themselves without progress, as if the prayer itself had been caught in the same loop as the road. An hour passed, then two. The guide began pacing, muttering under his breath. The porters refused to sit. No one ate. Just before full dark, the merchant emerged from the trees. He came from behind them. His clothes were torn. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat. He looked older somehow, as if the forest had pressed time into him unevenly. "Where did you go?" the catechist asked. The man stared at him, confused. "Ahead," he said. "I followed the sound. I never turned back." He described a path that none of them had seen, a narrow trail that climbed and dipped, always promising an end just beyond the next bend. He said he had seen a figure at intervals, tall, always partially obscured, long-limbed, facing away. "When I called out," the man said, "it slowed." "How long were you gone?" the guide asked. The merchant frowned. "An hour. Maybe less." The catechist checked the sky, checked his journal, checked the shadows that no longer aligned with expectation. "You were gone nearly 4, he said. No one argued. They made camp without fire. Smoke, the guide warned, would invite attention. They ate sparingly, saving what remained of their supplies. The laughter faded as night settled, replaced by something worse, a sense of presence that did not announce itself. Sleep came unevenly. Sometime before dawn, the catechist woke with the certainty that something was wrong. Not danger, absence. He reached for the food pack. The knots were intact, the wrapping undisturbed, and yet the contents felt lighter. He opened it carefully. Rice remained. Dried fish lay where it should. Nothing was missing in any obvious measure. But something had been handled. Oil had smeared the inner cloth. Crumbs dotted the ground nearby, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had eaten. The catechist looked toward the darkened path where no footprints led away. Behind him, the sound of slow, deliberate breathing rose once, close enough that he felt it move the hair at his ear, before fading back into the forest that still refused to let them go. By the third morning, they stopped counting hours, because the sun no longer told the truth. It rose too quickly, as if it had been waiting. The pale light slipped through the canopy in the wrong places, casting bars across the path that should have belonged to late afternoon. Shadows stretched the wrong way. The air warmed and cooled in uneven pulses, like breath. The catechist watched the sky through a break in the leaves and felt something inside him loosen. Something small and essential that had held his sense of sequence together. It was not panic. It was the realization that time, here, could be bent without breaking. That the forest did not need to deny reality completely. It only needed to tilt it. One of the porters swore that he had not slept at all. Another insisted he had slept for hours. Yet his body felt as though it had been dragged. Their faces looked similar, grey with fatigue, eyes swollen from strain. Yet each of them carried a different version of the night, like a private wound. The merchants argued in low voices. They had begun, without noticing, to repeat themselves. The same questions, the same reassurances, the same anger, cycling as predictably as the path itself. The guide did not argue anymore. He walked as if listening to something beneath the forest's noise, an instruction that wasn't spoken aloud. They moved forward because forward was the only direction they were allowed to believe in, and the road behaved almost correctly. That was what made it unbearable. If the path had become impossible, if it had ended in a wall of thorns, or vanished into a swamp, then the mind could accept the problem and start solving it. But this road was nearly the road they needed. It widened when it should. It dipped where the land naturally dipped. It offered signs of progress, a change in soil color, a shift in tree species, a distant opening that promised the edge of the jungle. Every detail whispered, yes, this way. Then a familiar landmark appeared again. A boulder with a pale streak down one side, like a scar. They had seen it yesterday near the bend where they camped. Only now it sat beside a different tree, as if the forest had rearranged its own furniture while they slept. The catechist stopped. He approached the boulder and placed his hand against it. The stone was warm. It should not have been warm in morning shade. He withdrew his hand as if burned. The repetition was no longer perfect. It was almost perfect, and that was worse, because it introduced doubt where certainty had once lived. Had they truly seen this boulder before? Was it another boulder like it? Was his memory failing? Or was the road learning what would break them fastest? They tried again to mark their passage. The catechist tore a strip from his cloth and tied it high on a branch, bright enough to catch the eye. He wrote in his journal, "Third morning, marked trail." An hour later they passed the cloth again. Only now it was tied lower, as if someone had moved it, or as if the tree itself had grown shorter. The catechist checked his journal and found his own handwriting altered. Not entirely, just enough. Letters that had been sharp now leaned. A word that had been third looked like first. He stared at it until his vision blurred. "You are overwriting yourself," one of the merchants said, trying to laugh. "You are tired." The catechist wanted to agree. He wanted to accept the simple explanation, because it was the only one that allowed him to remain a rational man in a world that rewarded rationality. But the guide looked back at him, eyes steady, and said quietly, "It wants you to argue." That was when the catechist understood something that made his throat tighten. Whatever was doing this, the Tikbalang, the forest, the road itself, it did not feed on fear. Fear was sharp. Fear made choices. Fear forced a person into action. This thing fed on confusion. Confusion made men stay. Confusion made them second-guess the one decision that mattered: leaving. As they walked, the forest offered them small humiliations. A sound like a distant bell, then silence. A faint voice calling one porter's name, correctly, intimately, then nothing. The smell of smoke as if from a nearby village, prompting desperate hope, only for the scent to vanish the moment they turned toward it. Once, they saw a clearing ahead with sunlight pouring through. The merchants quickened their pace without speaking. The porters followed, hearts rising despite themselves. The clearing was there, but it was smaller than it should have been, barely wide enough for a man to lie down. And at its center stood a single tree, and on the tree was a mark. A shallow carving in the bark. One of the merchants stepped closer, squinting. It was his name. He had carved it 2 days ago. He stumbled back, as if the tree had leaned toward him. The group fractured after that. Not physically, they still walked together, but in the invisible way that mattered. Trust began to dissolve. The catechist watched them glance at one another with suspicion, as if the road's trick required a human accomplice. When the guide spoke, one merchant ignored him. When the catechist offered prayer, another scoffed. One porter whispered that the guide must be leading them wrong on purpose, and the guide pretended not to hear. The forest watched the fracture and did nothing. It did not need to. By midday, they reached a stretch where the path ran straight for longer than any they had seen since leaving the coast. The trees pulled back slightly. The air moved. A bird called once, hesitant, as if testing whether sound was permitted again. Hope rose, brief and dangerous. "This is real," one merchant said. The guide did not answer. A minute later, the straight path curved gently, and the carved tree stood ahead again. The merchant shouted, a raw sound, not words, and kicked the ground until his toes bled. The catechist's mind began to splinter in smaller ways. He would think of a sentence and forget the ending halfway through. He would reach for his journal and pause, unable to remember what he meant to record. He would hear laughter and feel sure it was behind him, only to turn and find nothing, then hear it again ahead. Reality was behaving almost correctly. Almost, and that almost was turning them into animals. It was the youngest porter, the one who had been praying quietly since the second day, who finally spoke a countermeasure. In his village, when someone was naliligaw, you did not fight the forest. You did not shout at it. You did not demand it behave. You confused it back. He turned to the catechist and said, "Turn your shirt." The catechist stared. "What?" "Inside out," the porter insisted. "Make the world wrong for it." The merchants argued. The guide watched without expression. The catechist hesitated only a moment. He had run out of dignified choices. He pulled his shirt over his head and reversed it, seams outward, tags brushing his skin. The act felt childish, like superstition dressed as action. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not theatrical. The forest reacted the way a room reacts when someone speaks a forbidden name. The air thickened. Birds fell silent again. The path ahead shivered, not visibly, but in the mind's perception of it, as if the road had lost confidence in its own lie. The catechist's stomach tightened. Behind them, the measured footsteps, those patient, unseen steps that had haunted them since dusk on the second day, stopped. For the first time in 3 days, there was no sound of guidance, no laughter, no breathing, no promise, just silence so complete it felt like pressure against the ears. The catechist turned slowly, dread blooming cold through his fatigue. Something stood directly behind them. The moment they broke the spell, the forest went silent. Too silent to be natural. Not the ordinary quiet of a humid morning between bird calls, not the hush that comes after rain. This was a deliberate absence, like a room emptied of breath the instant an outsider steps inside. For a heartbeat, none of them moved. The catechist stood half-turned, his shirt still inside out, seams biting at his skin. The porters froze with paddles of breath stuck in their throats. Even the merchants, Men who had spent the last 3 days trying to argue their way out of the impossible fell quiet as if words had become dangerous. The guide's eyes were fixed on the path behind them. Nothing stood there, and yet the presence remained. It was not a figure, not yet. It was the sensation of being watched by something that had been watching them all along, and had now been noticed. The kind of attention you feel when you realize a stranger has been standing just out of view, listening to your conversation the entire time. One of the merchants let out a laugh that broke immediately into a cough. Relief tried to rise in him, but it had nowhere to land. The silence swallowed it. "Did it work?" he whispered, and the whisper sounded too loud. The porter who had suggested the countermeasure nodded once, but his face did not soften. His expression was not triumphant. It was wary, as if he had lit a torch in a place where fire was forbidden. The guide finally spoke. His voice was low, careful. "It can still hear us," he said, "but now it must choose." Choose what? The catechist wanted to ask, but the question stayed lodged behind his teeth, because the question itself was answered by the forest. The road ahead shifted, not physically, not in the way Earth moves when a landslide gives. The change was subtle, almost insulting in its restraint. A bend that had always curved left now felt as though it curved right. The angle of the path made the body want to step in a different direction than the eyes insisted. It was as if the road had been rewritten and their instincts were still reading the old version. The catechist took a cautious step forward. His foot landed on packed earth. Nothing pulled him back, nothing forced him sideways. The ground held. Another step, then another, and for the first time since the second day, the road did not loop. Relief surged through them like heat. Then dread followed it, cold and immediate. Because the forest did not feel defeated, it felt offended. In stories told by villagers and repeated quietly by porters at roadside camps, the Tikbalang was not a predator in the way Spaniards imagined predators. It did not hunt you for flesh. It did not charge out of the trees to rip you apart. It played, it mocked, it led travelers in circles until they broke themselves, until hunger, anger, and exhaustion turned them into their own worst enemy. And when the game ended, when someone used the old reversals, the inside-out cloth, the spoken apologies, the refusal to shout, something else happened. Not violence, permission. The catechist had read fragmented references to it in old friar commentary, dismissive notes about mocking spirits that were said to grow bored and release the traveler if properly ignored. Some accounts mentioned offerings left at crossroads. Others spoke of reversing garments, turning pockets outward, walking backward for a dozen steps, refusing to look behind when laughter sounded. The Spanish writers often treated these practices as quaint rituals. But what the catechist felt now did not resemble superstition. It felt like protocol, like boundaries. They moved quickly because none of them could bear to test the forest's patience. The guide forbade anyone from speaking loudly. He forbade arguments. He even forbade prayer spoken aloud. Not because he was irreligious, but because he had learned over 3 days that noise was an invitation. "Do not mock," he said. "Do not challenge. Do not ask it to prove itself." The merchants wanted to demand answers, but they had run out of confidence. Their minds were still bruised from the looping. Every tree looked capable of repeating itself. As they walked, signs of the enchantment remained, but weakened, as if the spell was fraying at the edges rather than snapping cleanly. They still caught glimpses of familiar landmarks, but now they appeared like echoes instead of barriers. A stone that looked like the scarred boulder, but smaller, as if the forest were offering an imitation. A bend that resembled the old bend, but led forward instead of back. Once, the catechist turned his head and thought he saw the carved tree again. His heart jolted. But it was only a tree with a natural scar in the bark, shaped like letters. His mind was now carving meaning into anything it could. Cognitive exhaustion did not vanish simply because the path allowed escape. If anything, it sharpened. Their bodies were moving forward again, but their thoughts still circled behind them. They reached a shallow stream by late afternoon. The water ran clear. Fish flickered beneath the surface. The sight should have been comforting. Instead, the catechist felt suspicion. It was too normal, too generous. The guide knelt, drank carefully, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He nodded to the porters. They drank as well, but none of them filled their gourds to the brim. "Take only what you need," the porter murmured. The catechist remembered a note he had once read, an account attributed to a traveler who escaped Naliligao after leaving a small offering of tobacco by a stream and walking away without looking back. The writer did not call it truth. He called it precaution. The catechist reached into his pack and removed a small piece of dried fish. He placed it on a flat stone near the water, not with reverence, but with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood that pride had no use here. He did not announce it. He simply did it. Then he walked on. The forest did not react. That, somehow, was worse than laughter. As dusk approached, the air cooled slightly and the canopy loosened. They began to see brighter gaps ahead, signs of thinner vegetation, of a path that might actually connect to a traveled route. The merchant's pace quickened. One porter began to cry silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. The catechist almost believed it was over. That was when they saw it. Not close, not looming from the brush like a beast in a tale. Just a silhouette, standing far off to the side where the trees opened briefly. Tall, unnaturally tall. Narrow-shouldered but long-limbed, with a head shape that did not belong to any man. The outline suggested length where there should have been a face, like the front of a horse's skull angled down. It did not step forward. It did not chase. It watched. The merchants froze. The catechist felt his throat tighten. His instinct screamed to stare, to confirm, to lock the image into certainty after 3 days of uncertainty. The guide lifted a hand in warning. "Do not look too long," he whispered. "That is how it keeps you." They obeyed, eyes dropping to the path. Their bodies moved forward, yet the awareness of that figure remained beside them, like heat from a fire you refuse to turn toward. The footsteps did not return. The laughter did not return. The breathing did not return. The Tikbalang, if that was what it was, did not punish them for breaking the game. It simply allowed them to leave. And that permission felt like the most terrifying part of all, because permission implies ownership. By nightfall, they reached the edge of a known route, a wider path where the ground was cut by many feet, where smoke from distant huts drifted faintly through the trees. The forest sounded alive again, insects, birds settling, the distant call of something hunting. Normal, they did not speak of what happened as they walked. Not yet. Not here. Only when they saw the first lamplight through the trees did the catechist finally breathe out fully, as if releasing a breath he had been holding since the 3rd morning. He looked down at his inside-out shirt and realized his hands were trembling. He turned it back the right way. The fabric felt wrong, as if the correct world was not as safe as he remembered. Years later, long after that journey had been written down in careful, restrained language that avoided words like spirit and enchantment, one of them would return to the region for ordinary business, and he would realize something that made his stomach drop with the same cold dread he had felt on the 3rd morning. The path still existed, and it had begun to move. The most disturbing detail was not how they escaped, but why they were released. Because if the forest truly wanted them gone, it could have ended it on the first day. A fall into a ravine, a fever left untreated, a wrong turn into deep water. In 1778, people disappeared on jungle roads for reasons no one questioned. The interior could swallow a man and never have to explain itself. But this was different. They were not swallowed. They were handled, led in circles, bent without breaking, shown the edge of panic, then pulled back, allowed to escape only after the right ritual, a reversal, an apology without words, a refusal to challenge the unseen guide. and that raises a colder question than any hoofbeat in the dark. If it could keep them, why let them go? Years after the journey, the catechist, older now, his hands steadier but his eyes less trusting, began collecting similar accounts, not because he wanted to prove the Tikbalang was real, but because he could not ignore the shape of what had happened to him. Patterns have a way of finding you again. He found them in the margins of missionary records, brief notes about delays that made no sense, about travelers reaching the same chapel twice in a day, about guides refusing to take certain roads after dusk. He found them in the reports of traders who returned pale and quiet, refusing to explain what they'd seen, only saying the road was wrong. He found them later, in the 19th century, when Spanish scholars and administrators began formalizing descriptions of local beliefs. They wrote the word Tikbalang with a scholar's distance, classifying it like an insect pinned to paper. Horse-headed, long-limbed, mischief spirit, road trickster. But beneath their official tone, the same details kept slipping through. The laughter that isn't quite laughter. The footsteps that match your pace but never appear. The landmarks that repeat with subtle differences. The sudden sense that the path is listening. And the strangest detail of all, the one no rational explanation could swallow cleanly. Many of the people who survived these episodes described the same thing afterward. Not gratitude, not triumph. A feeling of permission, as if they had been released only after they understood something. In the villages, the explanation was simple. The Tikbalang did not hunt you like an animal. It tested you like a boundary. The road was not only a road, it was a line between worlds, between places of safety and places that belonged to something older. A boundary enforcer. That concept changes everything. It means the Tikbalang isn't a monster waiting in the woods for prey. It's a presence attached to thresholds, roads between towns, crossroads where travelers choose direction, footpaths that cut through old forest, edges of clearings where human order meets wild order, liminal spaces, places where you are neither here nor there. And in liminal spaces, rules become negotiable. That is why the countermeasures weren't about fighting. They were about acknowledging the boundary, turning a shirt inside out, walking backward for a few steps, refusing to laugh back, leaving a small offering without looking for a reaction. Not because cloth has power, but because the act signals something deeper. I know I don't own this. That, the catechist realized, was the real weakness in the earlier days of their looping. It wasn't their fear. It wasn't their exhaustion. It was their certainty. They walked like men who believed the road belonged to them, because a road, in their world view, was something made to be used, conquered by maps, measured by time, reduced to distance. But the forest did not behave like a conquered place. It behaved like an entity with memory. When one of them carved his name into that tree, he thought he was leaving proof of progress. Instead, he may have been doing something else, marking territory, and the road responded like a thing correcting a mistake. In later decades, similar stories surfaced under different voices and different labels. Some were told in the language of superstition. Some were told as warnings to children. Others were told with a careful seriousness, by adults who had no interest in sounding foolish. A man walks home and arrives at the same bridge 3 times. A driver takes a familiar road and loses an hour with no explanation. A group hikes a loop they know well, then realizes their phone compasses disagree by 40 degrees. A laugh follows from the trees, always just out of reach. Modern people rarely call it Tikbalang. They call it glitching. They call it disorientation. They call it time loss. They call it my mind playing tricks. But the sensation underneath the vocabulary remains eerily consistent. The feeling that the world is almost correct, but not fully yours. Across cultures, the pattern appears in different costumes. There are stories of lights that lead travelers off roads in other parts of the world, of little people who guide you in circles for sport, of forest spirits who punish arrogance with misdirection. Briefly, the catechist noted these parallels, not to dilute what happened in 1778, but to recognize something unsettling. Humans have been naming the same experience for centuries. Only the names change. The existential escalation is not that a creature exists. It's that the environment can respond. That the forest can interact, not through claws, but through perception. Through the very mechanisms by which you navigate reality. Time, memory, direction, recognition. And once you accept that possibility, the Tikbalang stops being a tale of a horse-headed figure on a road. It becomes a warning about certainty itself. Because what the travelers learned in 1778 was not be careful in the woods. It was this: there are places where the road is not a promise, it is a permission. Years after the journey, one of the merchants returned to the region, as people always do when time dulls fear and necessity rewrites priorities. He told himself the old story had been exaggerated by exhaustion. He told himself he had survived it once and could survive it again. He asked local porters about the old path, the one that had trapped them in circles. They exchanged glances the way people do when a question is wrong. One older man, someone who had never met him before, someone with no reason to perform, said something quietly, like a correction offered to a child. "It's not always in the same place," he said. The merchant frowned. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged, eyes on the trees. "Paths move when they're remembered." The merchant laughed reflexively, then stopped, because he realized something that turned his stomach cold. The forest did not just remember them. They had been remembering the forest for years, in stories told at tables, in nervous jokes, in the quiet way you avoid certain roads even when you pretend you don't believe in anything, in the way a catechist writes something down, crosses it out, then writes it again smaller so it can survive. Memory is a map, and maps are invitations. That is why the Tikbalang let them go. Not because it was merciful, because the lesson only works if you carry it out of the forest. Because some travelers are not led astray to be lost, but to be reminded that the road does not belong to them,